Welcome to my course, Introduction to Angular. My name is Brian Mackey. I've been a full stack developer since 2007. I started my career early in .NET, C Sharp, and about mid-career I started doing front-end frameworks. I think I started Knockout and then a few others and got into Angular fairly early on, around beta time. This particular course covers Angular 2 Plus. This will be specifically Angular 8. Do assume a little bit of knowledge of JavaScript and HTML. I think you'll be okay if you don't have extensive experience in these things, but probably at least some familiarity will help. Angular is an opinionated framework. Basically means it provides the tools that you need to build a complete front-end website. You're going to have components. Angular has its own router that you can use. It has a styling framework that's very good. I think it's very much in line with where some of these other tooling has been going. Like React, I was using CSS modules a long time ago, which it's very similar to what we have in Angular now, and so on. We'll cover a lot of these things in this introductory course. I plan to do a follow-up course with some more advanced topics, a little deeper dive. In order to follow along with this course, you're going to need to install Node. The long-term support or LTS version is what I recommend from the Node.js website. Just click this and do the installation. You will also need the Angular CLI. The basic command is listed here. However, I do recommend going to Angular's website, the Angular setup guide. If you have any issues or questions, this will walk you through the basic setup. All we really need to do here is get the Angular CLI installed right here, and we'll walk through a little more of this as we go. The ng new app name is how you create your own fresh application. We will not be doing that in this course. We're going to be using this repo right here. Here's the repo. It's Brian Mackey / hello Angular. You can clone the repo using git. There you can just git clone and copy this URL right here. Once you've cloned the website, go ahead and open the code. I'm using Visual Studio Code. This is a free tool available from Microsoft. You can see our directory starts at source. We're going to be mostly working inside of the app folder here. And the entry point for this app is the app component HTML. You can see we have a few links here. We're going to come back to that. Let's just run npm start in the terminal to get the website going. Here's our basic website. We've got a few links here. We're going to go over these one by one. In this course, we will not be covering any of the advanced course material in this. We'll start with the basic component in Angular. A component is a basic building block of the website. One document that changed the way I do my web development is this Thinking in React article written by the React folks, the Facebook team out there. This changed the way that I build websites. I no longer look at a page as like a single entity. This is maybe a mock-up, and you might, in the older days, you might have built this all as just one block, one page, and nothing was really reusable, which caused some issues. Nowadays, you might look at this as a search element, a component in and of itself. So if I wanted to use this in a second page, I could just use that component directly without having to do a bunch of copy pasting. And Even more so, if I wanted to change this in some way, like change the background to gray, I could do that in one place, and that would update both pages. Or if I'm using this on 10 pages, it would update all 10 pages all at one time with just one simple change. And I think that's really the beauty of a component is that code reuse that we now get. Components built of the HTML code, which we call the template, and the TypeScript code behind, like we have here, very simple piece of code. And the test file, which generally React creates these for you. So they're great. We're not going to get into testing in this particular course, but I recommend you do write tests. And the SCSS file, SCSS is one of my favorite pre-compilers to use today. Some people use less. Some people even use just regular CSS. But I like a pre-compiler, so that's what we have here. A component in Angular consists of a selector, and a selector is like defining your HTML. So if I typed Mackie root, then that's what I'm talking about as the selector for this component. If I want to add this component onto this page, I type Mackie root. The template URL is the HTML file. In other words, the app component HTML is what is defined as the template for the app component TS file. And the style URLs are the name of the file that contains my SCSS. In this case, app component SCSS. We have several links on the home page. We have the home link, which just reloads the home page. And then we have our first link here called View Table Component. See, it added some data onto the page. It looked at the router outlet and it said, okay, well, what is the link? The router link is to table, since we clicked View Table Component Text, and our routing module says table is our path, which points to the table component. So by clicking that URL, we loaded a component, the table component HTML. Here is the HTML, which is just a very basic table with some names in it. And the code behind here, which points at the selector, which we didn't use in this case because we used the routing to get here. And the template URL and the style URL. If I wanted to use a selector to put a template on the page instead, I could say Mackie-table. And now when I go to the home page, you can see, the table component is now loaded on the home page. We see it loaded again when I go to the View Table Component link, go back home, and there's our component because I stuck it right here. Let's take it out, save the page, and it's gone. Load it up in the View Table component, go back home, it's gone. In order to generate a component, you can say ng generate component and the name. And I had to specify a module because this particular app has multiple modules. Don't worry about that right now. We'll talk about modules later. So now let's see, my test component. There we go. So Angular generated all that boilerplate code for me and put it under the app directory. Let's say I want to add that component to my home page. All I have to say is, well, I need to see what my selector is, Mackie-my test component. We'll say Mackie, save that out. And there we are. To summarize, the two ways we've covered to go to a component are by typing it into the HTML and by navigating via the router. You can have a router link that says, for example, table as the path. And if we look at our routes, find the path table, you can see that directs us to the table component, which will be loaded into the router outlet. App routing module consists of all of our routes, which has a path and a component relationship, and then we put those routes into the router module for route command. I'm not going to go into depth on that command, just know that this is the syntax that you use for this course. Next, we're going to talk about directives. Angular defines directives in 3 different ways. We have components, which are themselves directives. They inherit from directives. We have structural directives, which change the DOM. And we have attribute directives, which change behaviors, look, feel of a particular element without removing it from the DOM per se. Let's look at examples of structurals and attribute directives. First, we'll start with an attribute directive. This, again, changes the look and feel of a particular element. Notice that I have the selector named as Mackie border. I use a prefix because you don't want a collision of your prefixes with, say, something that's already defined in HTML. If HTML has a border selector, then you want yours to be different from the word border. So you can use a prefix, typically the company name, before all of your selectors. Let's look at an example of this in use. Let's take our test component that we just created, and we'll just say Mackie border. We added the attribute to the paragraph element, and now there it is. And if I take it off, just see, it's gone. Fairly straightforward. We have the element itself, calling the native element property to style, and then we can set our styles here. Now, structural directives is a little different. We see the selector is Mackie feature toggle, and there's some little bit of complexity in here to get at the DOM and conditionally render the element in question. We can see, though, that the definition is just slightly different. We have a little star wildcard here and the name of the selector, and I pass in an argument of advanced course content as a string. And let's take a look at the code. You can see that the Mackie feature toggle accepts a string as its argument, and the enabled decides whether to go ahead and override all the feature toggles and just make everything true, which I do not have enabled here inside of the local environment configuration file. So in this case, we're going to fall down to the check for the passed in feature toggle, which is advanced course content. And we see that that is set to true for my local environment. So is enabled is going to return true. And that will make the anchor for advanced course content render onto the page as we see it here. Now if I define a different, say something that doesn't exist, does not exist, feature toggle, then we see it has been removed from the DOM. Next, we're going to cover data binding, starting off with interpolation. That's a $10 word there. We have a class in Angular which supports a view in Angular. The HTML is the view. If we have a variable, say in the class, we will say the string equals Brian Mackie, logged in username is the variable, and we go into the view and we want to evaluate that variable. We just wrap it inside of these braces here, and that will give us the value inside, which is Brian Mackie. So if we look at the website, we can see logged in username, Brian Mackey, right there. And property binding is quite similar. You have a bracket on the left and the expression on the right. Is button disabled is defined here in our class, and that is converted to the value true, similarly to how our string was converted to the string value. Next, we're going to look at event binding. Let's go to our example here. If I have a button and I click on it, then that generates an event for the button being clicked. The events are bound with the brace syntax. We can say our method is onClick, which is defined in our class here, which simply shows that alert that we just saw when you click it. Then we have two-way binding, sometimes referred to as the banana in a box. This combines both the property binding and the event binding. Take a look at our two-way binding and Angular. The probably simplest way to do a two-way binding is to use ngModel with the banana in a box, and we say we're binding that to the logged in username. Now if I say, and I change it, updated, we can see that it is also updated in the interpolation value down here, because we're firing off an event that I changed this value. What if we use just one-way binding? Instead of using ngModel, I just say the value is equal to the logged in username. Well, let's take a look. If I change it, notice that the event does not fire, so I do not see an update here for the logged in username. And the reason being, we do not have an event. The banana, or the parentheses here, is our event. We are not using that syntax in this second example. To summarize, two-way binding combines property binding from class to template or class to view, and event binding from template to class or view to class. So we're going both directions. Finally, we're going to talk about services in Angular. Services are injected with Angular's dependency injector. Here I've created a straightforward service called Heroes Service. It is run on a JSON server that you can start with the simple command json-server and the file name .json. In this case, it's heroes.json. I have created a npm script that does the same thing. You can type npm run start JSON server, and this will show our started server. And as an example, the resource endpoint is heroes. We also have villains, which we're not going to go and look at in this course. If I take a look, you can see there is a list of heroes here, 1 and 2. So now we can query those with our heroes service at port 3000. We take Angular's HTTP client and we do a GET request using this syntax for our hero object, which contains these properties. Again, we can look at those: ID, name, date of birth. That maps up with our hero interface. And we can query either a get a single item by ID or get all items by hitting the root of heroes, as we did right here. We see that dependency injection in Angular is very clean. You define the parameter here in the constructor, and there's an implicitly created heroes service, which I can simply call by doing this.heroesService. I do not have to create my own property to handle this service. Angular does all this stuff behind the scenes for you, and you can call the method getAll to get all of the heroes, as we saw here, and put the result into the heroes object. We're using ng on init, which is called one time per directive before the view is initialized. So when we come in here, we will have the heroes list populated and we'll be able to display them in our view. Let's take a look at that in our service demo. There's our 2 items in our list, which is exactly what we would have expected. Services are that layer of abstraction to handle APIs. You can get and share data between components with a service. So if 2 components both needed access to the heroes list, then you could centralize that access to the API with a service. Similar to how we generated components earlier in this video, you can also generate services. Simply type ng generate service and give it the service name and path in the command line. Finally, we've covered this, but API mocking was used for this course. It's already been set up for you in this repo. However, if you wanted to set up your own, you can use the npm install JSON server. To summarize, Angular is a framework. It's similar to React in some ways, but more extensive, more opinionated. A lot of the patterns are already established for you. The tooling's already available for you, so there's no need to solve these problems yourself. I think that's a strong reason to use Angular when those things are important to your team. Angular is a component-driven framework. Angular 2+, everything has components. We've talked about how components are directives, and they provide reuse. They consist of a class and a view, and it's a powerful tool if you combine this with the thinking in React mindset. We covered structural and attribute directives. Again, the structural deals with the DOM, the attribute deals with appearance. We covered data binding with interpolation. You have property binding, you have event binding, and that leads you to the two-way binding. And finally, we closed out with services. Basically, the service is your centralized access to the API. I hope you enjoyed this course. Again, my name is Brian Mackey. Thank you.